I says, I don't know that much. I said, but I do know that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. When you take a life, that you're going to go to hell.
Hello, I'm Ruth Ann Leelisher, and you're watching Damascus Roads. The Mongols Motorcycle Club is one of the biggest and strongest in the nation. Andy Holgwin was just a kid who was raised in East LA who joined the club and later rose in power to become the Mongols' national president. This is Andy's story.
I grew up in East LA. We lived together, 5 brothers and sisters. Well, my mom, we were very close with my mom, and my dad was not around too much because he did work a lot. And when I got about 12 years old, that's when things started getting rough at home because all of a sudden my parents started having major problems. Around that time, I started going out and I started to learn how to dance. I became a real good dancer and was always getting in dance contests. It helped me to get away from the problems that I was having at home. There was a lot of fighting and drinking going on for a couple of years there, and then finally my dad moved out. They got divorced. After my dad had remarried, I went to go visit him, and my mother had taken me to leave me off there. I'll never forget this. I was about 15 years old, and she left me off, and I went in, and the lady opened the door for me, and she had made some dinner for me, and I sat down, and while I'm eating, I hear this big crash, and my mother broke the door in, and she wanted to beat up this lady, which was my stepmother, and I wouldn't let her. I grabbed her by the wrist. I was scared, and I wouldn't let her beat her up, so automatically I became the villain, and my mom turned on me, and she left that day, which was on a Saturday. But on Sunday, when I went home, she was waiting for me on the porch. She was drinking a beer, and as I came walking up, she said, "What do you want here?" So go back to that woman. You're more concerned about her, and you protected her. And all of a sudden, a rage came up in her, and she slapped me. And I told her, I says, I got angry. I says, "I hope you rot." And I went to go stay at my grandmother's, and we didn't talk for 2 months. And my mother ended up dying. It was a big turning point, I believe, in my life. After that incident, we gathered up my brothers and sisters. I was 16. We did, had the funeral, had the services. I remember it was very difficult for me to cry because my mom was the type of person who used to say, when I die, don't cry for me. Bring me a 6-pack of beer right now while I'm alive, And so those kind of things stayed with me, and it was very difficult, though. My grandmother and I, we started to try to raise my brothers and sisters. I didn't know how to deal with the responsibility. And my father came, he wanted to help, but he was already starting another family. And my brothers and sisters went through a lot of struggles. In the meantime, I'm still trying to be a teenager growing up. Car club era was just starting. Car club things, we had a little clique called the Whittier Boulevard Boys on Whittier Boulevard. And then the Midnighters made a song, Whittier Boulevard, and that just was an explosion.
Let's take a trip down Whittier Boulevard!
And next thing you know, people are cruising as bumper to bumper up and down the boulevard, and car clubs started popping up all over the place, and guys started fixing up their cars with hydraulics, and they were putting the best that they could to at that time. People were going to TJ to get their interior done, and there's some guys that started painting really good, doing graphics and those kind of things. And spoke rims were really popular then. If you had spoke rims, it was a big thing, and people were coming from all over. And of course, you started to have fights. And after a while, the violence started to escalate. And In those days, people would fight with bumper jacks and crowbars, and getting stabbed with a broken bottle was very common in those days. It happened to me. I got rolled around one day on the floor. In a blink of an eye, all of a sudden, I was against the wall, and there was these guys that were hitting me, and I felt something warm, but it didn't hurt. And I kept swinging, and all of a sudden, my arms got heavier and heavier, and I fell. And when I fell, I could hear what was going on, and they literally wanted to tie me to the bumper of their cars and drag me down the alley. That's when these other guys pulled up, and they jumped out with crowbars and bumper jacks. Well, one guy picked me up, but as this guy was picking me up, one of the guys that came to help me swung the bumper jack and hit me on the knee and tore a chunk of my knee out with a piece of bone. Next thing you know, I woke up in a cop car with a bunch of handkerchiefs on my stomach. I had gotten stabbed, and they took me in, and I got stitched up a little bit, and I believe I survived because those guys pulled in right at the right time. My thing was not violence. I didn't want to fight, but out there, when you start drinking and you start partying, it becomes part of it. And during that time, I went to a bike shop in La Puente, and I happened to look in the back there, and there was this guy that was sitting there, and he had a jacket on. And I was looking at these guys who were around him, and I saw him, and I asked the guy, I says, "Hey, isn't that Louis?" And they go, "Oh yeah, that's Prez Louis." I says, "Prez Louis?" And they go, "Yeah, that's Louis, he's from the Mongols." And I walked back over there, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And as I started to get near him, all these guys lunged forward like, "What are you doing?" And I'm looking at these guys like, what's their trip? I didn't know anything about bikers, about presidents or officers and all that. And all of a sudden, he told him, he goes, "Hey, this guy's all right." And we hugged, and we started talking, and he started telling me that they had this club, and there was a few other guys that we used to run together when we were in a car club. And I asked him, I says, "What do you got to do to get in your club?" They go, "We got to prospect." I said, "Well, what's prospecting?" They go, "Well, you got to earn your way in, you got to serve the guys, to just do whatever they tell you to do." That sounds easy enough. I didn't know what I was getting into. You had to light cigarettes, and somebody wanted a beer, you got to give them a beer. But there was also some tough things that you had to do. If there was a bar fight, you better be in there. If you've seen a brother that was outnumbered or whatever, you better be in the middle of it, taking care of business and stuff like that. And there was a lot of us that used to live up to that sex, drugs, and rock and roll image. Some of us were bullies. Some of us did things that, after a while, that you didn't want that type of person around. In the old days, we used to run out, you didn't go anywhere without a sleeping bag. Wherever you ended up, that's where you threw your sleeping bag down. You always had, at least 500-600 cases of beer. We'd have food, and we'd have partying and everything that, just go out there and let your hair down. You rode hard. A lot of guys had jobs, but it was easy, just your job, I'm not going to work tomorrow. We'll stay an extra day and party. And so going on runs was really a good time. Of course, there was confrontations with legendary clubs, and some heavy things happened. There's been books written about it. It's been in the papers and all that, and a lot of violence started to take place. I started coming up in the ranks, and I finally became president of the club, national of all the club, the whole organization. It's awesome to be going down the road, and you look in your mirror and you see 100, 150 set of handlebars in your mirror. Something happens to you inside. It's one thing to ride in the pack. It's something else to be in the head of the pack. Had a little number 1 on my glasses. Number 1. It was even funny, one time I got arrested, and they called to see if they had me in custody. And the bailiff says, "Oh yeah, we got number 1 here." And that was awesome to, even law enforcement is acknowledging who you are. But when you are number 1, there's also going to come a time that you're going to realize your responsibility, your accountability. And that's, for me, that was a turning point. Because when the conflicts came and the confrontations came with the legendary clubs, 2 brothers got killed. They were blowing off their motorcycles. At the funeral, we're going to have the wake, and the night of the wake, the funeral home gets blown up. All of a sudden, it wasn't important being the president and being the head, and being all these things that you believe you are. All of a sudden, the conviction hit me. Felt guilty, felt responsible. Something started to break inside of me at that time. The reality that innocent people, family members, were going to have to suffer. And it got pretty hairy. There was times that you had to stick your hand inside your window of your vehicle and turn the key and hope that it didn't blow up. Now, there was more attention being drawn to us by law enforcement. As far as a position, they knew I was the president of the club. They also believed that I was a hitman, a known hitman for the club. At that time, PCP was starting to come out and started getting caught up in PCP. Heroin was a no-no. Heroin was a no-no. As far as we were concerned, a hype was the worst thing you could be. Physically, I was trying to push myself, and I was drinking a lot and not getting rest, and there was a breakdown that started happening this time. I started getting paranoid. Pretty soon I didn't trust anybody. I was having difficulties in my marriage, my relationships with my wife, my kids, family, worried about them. Just all these things were going on at one time. It wasn't uncommon for my son and my daughter to see automatic weapons in our house. My wife used to answer the door with a shotgun. I have a younger brother. He had gone to the service. He came home on leave, and they had a party for him, and he had asked me if I would come and be a bouncer there at the party, and I told him no, because the guys that were where we lived at that time, I didn't get along too good with them. So as the party went on, some guys came, and they pretty much wanted to take over the party. So I had already been taking some pills and drinking some tequila. Well, I got my gun and decided to go over there. A couple of these guys from the street gang said they were taking over the party. And I just reached in my back pocket, pulled out my .38, and shot him. And they grabbed him. There was about 200 people there in the party, and they started to walk down the driveway. And as they were going out toward the street, they said, "We'll be back." And I said, "No, you won't." And I started firing at them. And they got their artillery, and we had a shootout there. And there's 200 people trying to scatter, run all over the place. And I went to court, and I was convicted for shooting this guy. And during that time, I started dealing drugs. Pretty soon I started snorting a little bit. After a while, I started fixing, and I became a heroin addict. I became what I hated the most. Then I didn't want to see any of my club brothers. I didn't want to see anybody. I was ashamed of what I became. My story is a story about a professional failure. Failed as a husband, failed as a father, failed as a friend, as an employee, failed as a club brother. And so I was dealing with all this failure. And then I became really scandalous. When you become a hype, you become scandalous. Everything revolves around your addiction. And shame came with that, a lot of shame. And I couldn't look at my kids face to face. Couldn't look at my family members, my wife. My wife said, she finally says, "You know what?" She says, I won't live like this anymore. I'll put up with a lot of other stuff, I was abusive with her physically, and I was unfaithful, a lot of things. But she says, against that drug, I can't compete against that drug. And she says, I refuse to live this way anymore. And I promised her that I was going to try to change and all that. And she says, no, this time I don't even want to listen to you, because every time I do, you pick me up and you drop me. You pick up the kids, you drop them, And she says, you need to see yourself. So I got a year in the county jail and 5 years probation.